My name is Bill Green. I'm the director of the MIT Energy Initiative, and I want to thank you all for coming to the next talk in the MITEI's seminar series. The MIT Energy Initiative plays several roles on campus, but one of them is to try to convene leaders in industry, in government, in nonprofits, and in academia to foster the discussions that will identify the innovations, the new ideas, the new approaches that can speed up the energy transition. Today we're going to talk about one of the key aspects of the energy transition is that we need to get the two biggest economies in the world on the same page so that those countries can lead the transition and not divide the transition. As you know, there's many political angles on this, and this is quite a big challenge. But fortunately, we have a speaker today who's thought about it more than I'm sure anyone in the room has. Ambassador Burns did his formal schooling at Boston College and then at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Study. He was the American Consulate General in Jerusalem in the mid-1980s, a member of the National Security Council under President George H.W. Bush and also under President Bill Clinton, and then subsequently held ambassadorships to Greece and then to NATO. During the George W. Bush administration, he was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and was involved in key negotiations related to Iran's nuclear program. I think Ernie Moniz sitting next to him might have had known something about that as well. Okay. And also involved in the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, which was quite an important agreement at that time period. Ambassador Burns served as the U.S. ambassador to the People's Republic of China from 2021 to 2025. He's currently the Goodman Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Burns.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Green, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. I wish I had the expertise that Professor Green does in chemical engineering or in energy. I'm the guy who's come to talk to you about the framework of our current relationship with the People's Republic of China. How are we doing? What's the level of competition? Is there room for cooperation between the two countries? Is the Thucydides trap going to write our history in the future? I don't think so, but let's talk about that. But I'm really pleased to be here. And pleased to be also with Dr. Former Secretary Ernie Moniz, who our paths have crossed in government and out of government. Ernie came twice, and we talked when I was in China. And he's done some important work. I think I might call on him to say a few words at the appropriate time. He hasn't prepared for this, but
no, I'm going to ask you a question.
And both of us are still in a state of shock over a momentous event that happened on Sunday evening, and that we're members of Patriots Nation. So the defeat of the absolutely convincing defeat of the Patriots by any Seattle Seahawks fans here from the Northwest. Congratulations, great team. But we're young and we'll be back. So I was a career Foreign Service officer for the United States, and that means that we are nonpartisan. I served from my earliest intern days, 1979 in the Jimmy Carter administration, all the way through to President Biden, and served 3 Republican presidents and 3 Democratic presidents at that time. And I wanted to say that because the atmosphere in our country is hyper-political right now, and I come from an environment having worked for so many different administrations. First 10 years of my career were the old Cold War. And I ended up working in the White House for 5 years at the end of the Soviet Union when it crashed and burned and splintered into 15 new states in December 1991, all the way through just to last year when I returned from China. And I tend to look at our foreign policy through that nonpartisan lens, if that's at all helpful in framing this discussion. Let me say a word about the U.S. China relationship, where we are now, and then say a word as to how energy, whether it's climate change or clean energy cooperation or the industrial aspects of this sometimes intersect in this relationship. In some administrations more intensively, obviously, than in others. And then let's open it up for a discussion of anything that's on your mind about the U.S. China relationship. I'll do my best to answer your questions. And I thank you all for being here. Let me start by saying the obvious. This is the most important relationship that we have in the world. We are the two largest global economies, the United States and China. We're the two strongest militaries. And if you think about global reach, the ability of countries to affect, have an impact on other countries, I think it's fair to say, and I hope for the non-Chinese and non-Americans here this doesn't sound arrogant, I think it's factually true, analytically true. These are the only two countries that affect everybody else in the international system because of our weight, because of the economic weight, the military weight. In the case of China, I would say the extraordinary nature of the Belt Road Initiative. President Xi initiated it in 2013. About $1 trillion US spent out in loans and in grants. It's given China a lot of weight and a lot of influence in the global south. And that's just an objective analytical statement. And these two countries are also leading in the area of politics, international politics and diplomacy, technology. That's going to be the most important transformative agent in global politics as we go forward. I visited every major Chinese university. I come from a university. I was at Harvard when I was appointed to China and made a point of going to Tsinghua and Fudan and Chengdu and Zhejiang and Nanjing. These are great universities. In many ways, very much the equal in qualities of students, seriousness of purpose, quality of faculty of any university in our country. I tried to go to Beida, Peking University, because I was living in Beijing for 3+ years. And we requested, or professors at Beida requested that I attend, and I was turned down on 11 separate occasions from 2022 until early 2025. And I was feeling bad about this because, you know, I'd heard what a great university Beida is, and it is a fact that Beida actually, the institution was put together by a group of American universities well more than a century ago, but they wouldn't let me come because I think there was a party secretary of the Communist Party of China. There's always a party person in any business, in any academic institution, and always in government agencies who didn't want the American ambassador to be there. So I thought this is a very strange environment to be in. And I was reading the memoirs at that time of George H.W. Bush, and I'd worked for him when he was president. He was our second American ambassador after President Nixon's opening in 1974 and 75. And I was just reading his memoirs one night, and he said, Beida won't let me, back in 1974, visit their campus. I immediately said, well, if George H.W. Bush has been excluded, who am I to complain? But then, obviously when Vice President Harris lost the election and President Trump won in our system, ambassadors resigned. And so I was preparing to leave, and 4 days before I left China in the winter, last winter, January 2025, I received a call from a friend of mine, I cannot name him, who's a senior member, Chinese, of the Beida faculty. He said, I managed to do it. Can you come over and meet me at this gate at 2 p.m. And he gave me a great tour. We had lunch. We had a great talk with members of the faculty, so I did get there in the end. But the point is, I think that's a big part of Chinese power in the world today and influence in the world, the focus on technology. So there's an amazing data point that I came across in to illustrate this in The Economist magazine 6 months ago. 36% of all Chinese first-year university students major in STEM fields. 5% of American first-year university students, you know where I'm going with this, major in the STEM field. Think about the volume of graduates and the disparity between our country and China. And then think about the percentage of those graduates who go into science and technology and the focus of parents and kids and the Gaokao, which is their super SAT test. You know, you apply to university in China, Chinese students do not have the extracurricular activities available to them that we have in our high schools. It's all about merit. It's all about knowledge. It's all about academic achievement. I have a lot of respect for the Chinese educational system. And that's part of the power base of China. So what does the relationship look like today? Highly competitive, tough, adversarial. We use those words, both of us, to discuss the relationship. We're competing with each other. We're adversaries. We're rivals. I think it breaks down into 4 areas. Number 1, we are both competing for military power in the Indo-Pacific. I decided not to bring my PowerPoint, because I didn't want this to be death by PowerPoint. I wanted to have a discussion. But, you know, I think all of you see the map of the Indo-Pacific. It is the power map of the world. If you travel from the Arabian Peninsula across the Arabian Sea to the subcontinent, the Bay of Bengal, Strait of Malacca, up to the big Asian economies, China, Japan, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands. That's the power map of the world. 4 of the 5 largest economies in the world are on that map. The only one that isn't is the European Union. And I think the 4 strongest militaries in the world are on that map in no particular order: China, the United States, Japan, and India. And so we are increasingly focused as a society on that map. You see the Trump administration very much, I think, in concert with the Biden and previously Obama administrations, and Ernie and I have served in a couple of these, thinking that as the Atlantic world, post-World War II, was once the strategic focus, this has to be our strategic focus. It's also China's strategic focus. And so we see in this military competition an enormous buildup of Chinese military power, technological power, introducing aircraft carriers. There are now 3 Chinese aircraft carriers. 10 years from now, China and the United States will probably be able to field roughly equivalent 10 or 11 aircraft carriers out of port into the Indo-Pacific or other parts of the world. Think of the vast improvements in the Chinese ballistic missile capacity. If you think about the first island chain, I really should have brought my map, from the Japanese home islands through Taiwan and the Philippines, that's an area where the United States Navy has been predominant since the close of World War II in September 1945. China trying to make that's impermeable to Western naval influence out to the second island chain. Think of Guam, far to the east. Chinese ballistic missiles have enormous reach, and that affects the military strategy of the United States, of Australia, of Japan, of the Philippines, of South Korea. So there is a battle, a competition for which of these countries can mobilize doctrine and power, whether it's naval power, air power, surface power, subsurface power, to become the controlling power in that part of the world. And that is I used to tell my team at U.S. Mission China, our embassy in Beijing, our consulates in Shenyang, northern China, in Chengdu, on the Yangtze River, in Shanghai and Guangzhou, we cannot afford to be number 2 in military power 10 years from now. That's not going to be in the interest of the United States because we're on that Indo-Pacific map. You think of Alaska, and you think of Hawaii, and you think of Guam, and you think of American Samoa, and you think of Washington and Oregon and California. We're on that map too. That's going to be where a lot of the history of the next 10, 15, 20 years is going to play out, and we're really focused on that map, and so are the Chinese. So is the Chinese military leadership. That's the first area of competition. Second area is technology. I think if you had asked me the day I arrived, or the day I was confirmed in 2021, confirmed by the Senate, how important is technology? I would have said very important. If you ask me now, central, center stage, for 2 reasons. And all of you at this university will understand this far better than me. If you're science and tech oriented, the transformative future of artificial intelligence. of quantum computing, of synthetic biology, biotech, of cyber, and of space. And whichever country is both first mover, but I think also first adapter, and the Chinese are very skilled in terms of industrial processes and doctrine of adapting quickly. Think of DeepSeek. It wasn't first to the market, but it was first to many other markets at a lower cost. This whole competition in commercial technology is really what's apparent to a lot of people. It's what we read about and study, and it's real. But it also links to the first area of competition. Because I think, and I'm sure Ernie's going to have some thoughts on this, if you think about military power, we may be looking at a revolution in military technology produced by the MITs of the world and the Xinhuas of the world, and all the innovation that's occurring in both countries, so that would I make a bet that 10 to 15 years from now, the aircraft carrier will be the potent, not just symbol, but agent of military power than it is now? I'm not so sure. Do I think that the F-35 will actually be in the field or in the air 15 years from now? If the pace of technological change is quick enough, as we expect it to be, we're looking at an entirely new arena of military technology that will flow from universities, research labs, and the high-tech companies that are increasingly dominating this space. Let me give you an example. The way I first started thinking about this was I remembered I was a history major as an undergrad, European history. Think of the First World War. The first day of the First World War, August 1914, the Poles rode into that war on horseback. And 4 years later, the tank had appeared for the first time in human history on a battlefield, and the aircraft, an aircraft, had appeared for the first time in human history on a battlefield. I think we're looking at that kind of revolutionary change based on technology, center stage in this relationship in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Just look at the Ukraine war. As of February 24th of this year, it'll be the 4th anniversary of that brutal, cynical, barbaric invasion of Ukraine by Putin. And how did the Ukrainians defend themselves at first? Through technology, through doctrine. Faster, if you will, to the battlefield than the Russians. Now, 4 years later, the Russians have not only caught up, they've probably surpassed, unfortunately, the Ukrainians in the application of technology, new technologies, to the battlefield. So this is a really interesting, I would say, vital space. If you're trying to determine power in the world in the 2030s and 40s, that question will hinge on who's best to the market, who unites technological process with policy. So that's the second area of competition. Third is trade and economics, and this is complicated between the U.S. and China. We are rivals because we have big economies that they don't always meet together. So there's trade disputes, which is not terribly abnormal in global politics, but the problem we have is that we have a $750 billion two-way trade relationship in goods and services. China is the third largest trade partner of the United States after our two North American neighbors, Canada and Mexico. But it's a difficult relationship to manage. I spent a lot of my time working with American CEOs, American companies, just trying to help them level the playing field. And what do I mean by that? The playing field is not level for American, Japanese, South Korean, European, Australian, Singaporean, Malaysian companies in the Chinese market. There's still a considerable amount of intellectual property theft. And increasingly, IP is the coin of the realm for most companies. And there's a high degree of theft by rivals of some of these companies. But more than that, we've been very clear about this, the Chinese state uses its power to help Chinese companies rip off the intellectual property of foreign competitors. That's one problem. A second problem is forced technology transfer. Most non-Chinese companies in the market, and there are thousands of them, 10,000 American companies alone on the ground in China, you have to have a joint venture partner. And invariably what happens if technology is part of what you do is that you have your partner, you enter the market, and at some point they want you to share your most sophisticated technology with them, or they'll sink you in that market or eject you from the market. And that contravenes normal trade regulations of the World Trade Organization, which is not right now a very effective organization. It's kind of moribund, but still we object to that. And so those are two major problems in our economic relationship. And you've seen the third major problem. We had an outright trade war between early April of 2025 and late October, when President Xi and President Trump met in Busan, South Korea. At one point, you'll remember, 145% tariffs by the United States, 125% by China on the United States. You know, that just grinds a relationship. Those level tariffs, had they been sustained, would have meant zero trade between the two countries. So what we have now is we have a truce in the trade war and a truce in the supply chain war, when China rolled out the rare earths card and cut off the United States and its industrial partners in the West from rare earths for 30 days. It forced the Trump administration back to the negotiations, and the Trump administration played some of their cards, airplane parts and aspects of advanced computer technology. So it's kind of at a standstill right now on trade. And it's very important, obviously, for our economy. And one of the more pernicious aspects of the trade dilemma that we face with China, and Secretary Janet Yellen and I had hours and hours of meetings with Vice Premier He Feng, who manages economic affairs for President Xi, about this, is that China wants to sustain 5% GDP growth per annum. And one way most people think that China never really has reached that in recent years. The real growth rate's probably 3.5, 3.7%, but they say 5%. China is now pushing out to the rest of the world manufactured products below the cost of production, i.e. dumping, so that they can achieve market share in Japan, in Europe, in North America, kill the competitors in those domestic markets, and then grab greater market share. This is the Chinese playbook. China is now 33% of all global manufacturing in the world is in China. They're a powerhouse. And they are the largest manufacturer in the world. They're the largest exporter in the world. But Secretary Yellen said, and she was very public about this, if you continue to try to dump your manufactured products or your electric vehicles or your lithium batteries or your solar panels on our market, tariffs are going to go up. And it's really interesting in 2024 and 2025 to ask, who raised tariffs on China? It wasn't just Joe Biden, who put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs and 50% on lithium batteries and 25% on solar panels. It was India raised tariffs, and Turkey raised tariffs. South Africa, a very close political ally of China, raised tariffs on China. Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, Canada, the United States, and the EU. So there's been a furious pushback against this big push by the Chinese to dominate other markets, and this does have an impact on a lot of the different energy issues that we've talked about. That's a third area of competition. And fourth, and I'll end on this. Fourth area of competition, I'd say in many ways, is probably the most important, ultimately. In our Constitution, in our Bill of Rights, we believe in human freedom. We believe in the civil liberties of freedom of the press and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion and the rule of law. That's on our books. It is often contested in our society, even now. But China doesn't believe in any of that. And that difference is a very difficult difference to manage. I'll give you one example. Jimmy Lai was sentenced to 20 years in prison yesterday. What was his crime? He ran a newspaper and a news service in China from the 1980s all the way through to the big demonstrations in Hong Kong in 2019. And he has spent the last 5 years in solitary confinement. He's 78 years of age. He's in poor health. And his daughter and son both said yesterday, if you sentence our father to 20 years in prison for having the temerity to engage in freedom of the press and freedom of speech, that is, he's going to die in prison. And so there's been a tremendous outcry around the world to support him. And I really hope that President Trump and other leaders, Prime Minister Takaichi, and the European leaders will prevail upon the Chinese, let him go. Humanitarian parole. Maybe he can't live in Hong Kong. I don't know what the terms would be. Let him live. But that's a symbol of this huge difference between our two governments about the type of societies we want to have and the type of rights that we want individuals to have. So think about those 4 areas of competition: military competition, tech competition, trade and supply chain competition, values competition, and we both want to be number 1. And neither of us, to be honest, is willing to be number 2. So here's the test, and I'm going to end on 2 quick points. Here's the test. Can we learn to compete and manage the competition so that we both give it a shot to protect our interests, but not in such a way that we drive it to a catastrophic ending? And I mean war. If you think about the destructive capacity available, and Secretary Moniz knows a lot about this, in our nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. 70 million people died in the Second World War. 19 million people died in the First World War. If there had been a Cuban Missile Crisis, actually a war in October 1962, our mutual friend, Professor Graham Allison, who's written the great book about it, Essence of Decision, if you're looking for an extraordinary book to read to explain that crisis, Graham thinks that 80 million people would have died between the Rocky Mountains and the Ural Mountains in October 1962. I was 6 years of age. I just remembered the fear in my household, my parents and older siblings. That's what's at stake. And so I think we all in this relationship, and I think this includes the Chinese leadership, feel a heavy responsibility not to go that far. Manage the competition, which is normal in global politics between strong states, but do it in such a way that we don't even get close to the use of this massive force that both of our governments are in possession of. And the way you do that is you try to get your military people to talk together. The Chinese have been very resistant to that. President Biden suggested on multiple occasions, let's get our admirals together. Let's get our generals together. They get to know each other, but more importantly, if there's an accident, and we've had them before because our navies and air forces are operating in very close juxtaposition to each other in the Senkaku Islands of the East China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, and in the Spratly and Paracel Islands of the South China Sea. This is international waters, international airspace. In 2001, 2 planes collided. The Chinese pilot died. American plane went down on Hainan Island. It took 2 weeks to resolve the crisis. You don't want to go there. And if there's ever an accident and we can't talk to each other, and Secretary of State Colin Powell was in charge of our side in 2001, and he came to Harvard 10 years ago and said it took him 3 days even to get his Chinese interlocutor on the phone. So we've got to normalize the kind of communication and engagement to prevent the worst from happening. Final point. I've just described a pretty harrowing relationship. Is everybody sufficiently depressed? Because I'm looking out at this sea of faces and I feel depressed too. I would say that my team and I spent 80% of our time on the competitive edge, on those issues that I talked about. And I think that's probably the right percentage of time given the gravity of these issues. But there are issues where our interests are aligned. Number one is climate change. In our administration, we believe in the science, in the Biden administration, in the Obama administration where Ernie was secretary, we believe in the science. We believe in the predictions. We believe in what it means for 8 billion people. And so our view was we don't have identical positions with the Chinese, but we want to work with them. So President Biden appointed John Kerry to be our first climate negotiator with the Chinese and with everybody else. And then when Secretary Kerry left in early 24, John Podesta, very close advisor of President Biden, took over. I thought this was one of the most important things I did, so we all worked with Xie Zhenhua, the legendary Chinese climate negotiator. And when he retired, with Ambassador Liu Zhenmin. And what did we have in common? We're the two largest emitters of carbon in the world. China now 31%, 32% of global emissions. The U.S. somewhere between 10 and 11, two largest. So there was a self-interest that we saw in each other. We need to work with each other for the good of both of our countries. But I think President Xi was sincere when he met with President Biden, and they helped to put together the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. They also had an obligation to the rest of the world. And so we took that very, very, very seriously. We didn't have exact positions. The Chinese felt that we should do more on renewable energy. And President Biden, through the Inflation Reduction Act, put together a package of $269 billion in tax incentives and programs, which we felt was going to transform our economy. And of course, President Xi, you've seen this extraordinary growth in solar and in lithium batteries, electric vehicles. When I first arrived in China, GM and Ford were doing okay. And Tesla was actually the leader. By the time I left China, there were 3 or 4 Chinese companies led by BYD who had raced past the American companies because of this incredible ecosystem in Shanghai and in South China about manufacturing, about robotics, at scale, speed. And my wife and I sometimes on the weekends would go into Chinese car showrooms. Extraordinary technology, extraordinary comfort, styling. China is leading the world now, and this has been a very rapid development. Our view was, in the Biden administration, we needed to play catch up. We needed to strengthen our own industrial and scientific basis, tech basis on cars. That now has gone by the wayside in the current administration. We did believe that the Chinese needed to do more on methane, on nitrous oxide, and certainly in the burning of coal. The interesting dichotomy in the Chinese energy picture is they're leading on clean energy by 15 miles, but they're still producing coal plants and still burning coal. And so we saw that as an inconsistency. But each year when we went to the COP meetings, Podesta and Kerry would co-chair a meeting with the rest of the world, with their Chinese counterpart, to show that the United States and China could work together. So that's not going to happen now. President Trump's been very clear. We're shutting down that cooperation with the Chinese. I think this is a major mistake. It's going to hurt the United States. It'll hurt the rest of the world that we're not participating technologically or diplomatically. But that's an issue where I think in the future, at some point when the pendulum swings back and different people are in charge in Washington, if you believe in science, if you believe in the facts and in data, you're going to have to act on those. So that's one area. Second area is interesting, artificial intelligence. President Biden and President Xi had a final meeting November 24th, 2024, so 10 days after President Trump won his election. And we were working with the Chinese for a couple of months on one sentence that we hoped both presidents would be able to say publicly in Lima. This is the margins of the G20 meeting. And at the meeting that we had with President Xi, he said, yes, I agree with this one sentence. Human beings should be in control of nuclear weapons, not AI systems. Human beings should be in control of nuclear weapons, not AI systems. The two most powerful countries technologically and military in the world agree on that. That gave me a little bit of hope that despite the competition, despite the mistrust, and it's all there, the rivalry, we understand we're entering a really, in many ways, hopeful part of human history through what you're all doing on quantum, biotech, cyber, space, AI, but there's a dark side of this. And you want women and men with a conscience, with a heart, with a brain, thinking about the welfare of 8 billion people to make these decisions. So not just human in the loop, human dominating that loop. And that gave me a little bit of hope that as we look ahead and try to manage this relationship, there are some issues where we can work with the Chinese. The other one is fentanyl. That's the leading cause of death in our society here. Americans 18 to 49. And the majority of the precursor chemicals that the drug cartels from Mexico who fabricate the synthetic opioid use, the majority of the precursors come from the Chinese market. Now, very importantly, they do not come from the government of China. They come from the black market. And so we were able to convince the Chinese in 2023 that they should help us, and they have. They've shut down online platforms. They've arrested people. It hasn't been enough. It hasn't resolved the problem, but there's progress, and this is a Biden-Trump issue. Both presidents are working on it. We are trying our best to work with the Chinese in turn, and I have some hope that some dramatic inroads could be made on that issue as well. So I didn't want to leave you entirely depressed by this presentation today, but it gives you a snapshot of what President Trump is dealing with, what President Biden did, but what we are all dealing with. How many Chinese citizens in the room today? And I'm glad to see you all here. How many Americans in the room? How many non-Americans and non-Chinese in the room? It's a big group. I think we've, final point, just looking at this group here, Professor, we're at a stage of human history where we're all linked together. And the fate of everybody in this room and all of our countries is linked together by these huge transnational challenges. So we've got to learn to compete and yet live in peace with each other in the process. So let's take this conversation anywhere you want to take it. Any question is fair. I can talk about why the Patriots lost the other night, have my own views. I'd like to bring Secretary Moniz into the conversation at some point because, as you all know, Secretary Moniz and Secretary Kerry were the major negotiators, senior negotiators, of an agreement that I supported, which was the JPCOA with the Iranians on the Iranian nuclear program. There are issues concerning the non-transparent nature of China's nuclear weapons buildup. So at some point, if you've got questions there, I'm going to punt them to Secretary Moniz. But if you just let me know your name, maybe if you're a student here, what you're studying, and we'll take it from there.
Great, sounds good. Have a seat. All right, so we have a lot of audience. Let's take some questions. Do we have? How about way in the back with the beard?
Yeah, hi, my name is Stephen. I'm a current graduate student in chemistry.
Hold on, Stephen. Use the microphone so we can hear you.
Hello.
Water.
So my name is Stephen. I'm a current graduate student in chemistry here. I was wondering, with respect to K-12 education, what are the top lessons we can learn from the Chinese system, and what are the top things that we should preserve in our current system?
I'm a little bit humble on this issue because, you know, I didn't have kids. Our kids are older in the Chinese school system. I spent a lot more time in universities than I did in primary education. What I heard from Chinese friends and Chinese contacts was they study really hard. Most Chinese students are more or less in school 6 days a week. And parents very focused on kids' education, which I deeply admire. And after-school education, which actually President Xi attacked that industry in 2021, and it was not popular to do that because education is the ticket up in Chinese society. So I was impressed by the degree to which when I would meet Chinese high school students, there's no student council, there's no soccer team, there's no glee club. There's academic discipline and pursuit. And frankly, I thought that was refreshing. I did. And if you know, these kids face a monumental exam as 18-year-olds, the Gaokao. In fact, I would put out every year when the Gaokao was offered a Weibo and WeChat message in Mandarin. Someone had to do it for me because my Mandarin's really poor. I'm a struggling, humble student of Mandarin. Just saying good luck. And you know, tens of thousands of people would circulate that because that's the big day for Chinese students. So they study extremely hard. I must say also, it's replicated in the society at large. I've lived in 8 countries as a student and as a diplomat. And without any invidious comparisons to any of those other countries, I've never seen any country where people work as hard as the Chinese. You know, Chinese say we have a 996 culture. We work 9 a.m., 9 p.m., 6 days a week. It's not true. It's 997. Because on Sundays, and that was probably my only day off, I get calls from the Chinese Foreign Ministry at 2 in the afternoon. Can you come in and talk? Sunday afternoon too. I'd say it's Sunday afternoon too. Come in and talk. And then you go to the construction sites. They're open. People going to work. Not everybody, but I really admired the fact, the dynamism, the hard work of the Chinese people. So that, in a way, maybe helps to answer the question. I didn't go to primary school classrooms. I went to high schools and universities. Well, these are serious places. And education is taken very seriously culturally, which I think is a very good thing.
Another question, maybe up here in the front? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jing. I'm a third-year graduate student at the Mechanical Engineering Department. And my question is, you've mentioned the need for the U.S. to win this tech competition with China. And however, current visa politics often enforce Chinese STEM students into a state of travel limbo. Yeah. Because administrative processing frequently limit us to 1-year visas. So many researchers and students like me choose not to attend any international conference or visit home for years to avoid being stuck outside of the United States. So in your view, is there any way to balance the national security without creating these levels of instability and deterrence? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. It's a complicated issue, obviously, and I'll just say a few things. Like every other American in this room, I'm part of our immigrant society. We all have the same story. In my case, two of my grandparents, my father's parents, are immigrants, teenage immigrants, uneducated from Ireland. And that's a very typical story. So as I think about the power of the United States, I think the immigrant basis of our society is one of our greatest powers. Multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. That's who we are. I believe in DEI. I've seen it work very well, both at Harvard and at the State Department. In my last mission in China, we had a DEI council. It made us better. We reflected the diversity. My team were from all over the world. We had refugees, we had first-generation Americans, we had naturalized Americans, we had Americans whose families have been here for 300 years. And so point one is, I think if we begin to close too many doors, or we even ask people when they apply for a visa from Belgium, give us your social media history for the last 5 years, I think that's a great mistake. That being open sustains us. This university, Harvard, are just two examples. Every university prospers from openness, so that's point one. Now I get to the difficult part of it. President Trump issued an executive order in 2020 that essentially said that the United States Embassy and consulates in China should review visa applications of Chinese STEM applicants, particularly in certain fields for graduate study. And it's very difficult if you're a Chinese student in certain fields at the graduate level to obtain a visa. I agree with that policy. I agree with that policy. Because there have been too many violations of that, maybe of trust, and too many examples of the Chinese government using its influence through students in the United States for what I would say are nefarious purposes. So the Biden administration not only agreed with that policy, but fully implemented it, and it was my mission that implemented it, and I still think it's the right policy. And by the way, China essentially has the same policy, but just doesn't talk about it. We are transparent about these things. We have to be and should be. So that's another aspect of this. So let me just give you a hypothetical example, which is a little bit artificial, but if you appear at the visa window of our embassy and consulates and you want to design, and you're a Chinese student, and you say, I want to study nuclear weapons design at Caltech, you're not going to get the visa. And I think that's, we're in such a competitive relationship, especially in technology. Both of us have to take precautions, and that's one of them. I know that will make many people here deeply unhappy, and I understand that, but I think this is the right policy for our government. It doesn't mean we close our doors to Chinese students. We have, I think at last count, 273,000 Chinese students at our universities, mostly at the undergrad level, but even at the graduate level in certain fields at this university, students are getting visas. And I think that's good. I wouldn't want to see the Chinese student population disappear from this country. I hope we can even build it. Over 300,000. Our problem has been American students in China. When Ernie was Secretary of Energy, I think we had 15,000 American students in China. Because of zero COVID, the Chinese policy of lockdowns and testing in 2021, 2, and 3, that population went from 15,000 to 350 by 2022. But when I left, I asked my team, how many students do we have now? Because I worked with university presidents and provosts, including from this university, to say, please send the American students back. Please send professors back in fields that are appropriate. And my team said we have 1,104. I said, how did you arrive at that number? We called every Chinese university. And so the next week I went to Guizhou University, December 2024. 50,000 students, very impressive university in a very poor province. I met with the university president. I said, Mr. President, I understand you don't have any American students. He said, we actually have a student. And he's right behind this curtain. Do you want to meet him? I said, yes, I want to meet him. And because he told me I could use his name publicly, this wonderful young man, Jordan Shelley, came out. He was 19 years old. He was from Sacramento, California. I said, how'd you get here to Guizhou University? He said, very simple. He said, I had a girlfriend in my Sacramento, California high school. She was an immigrant from China, from the Miao community, a minority community in China, and she convinced me that Guizhou University was the center of the world. I said, that's why you're here. He said, that's why I'm here. And I said, and your girlfriend? He said, we broke up. What are you studying? And it was interesting. He kept speaking to me in a mix of Mandarin, and I've already told you I have horrible Mandarin, although I try, and English. And I said, you're speaking both languages. He said, I haven't spoken English in 6 or 7 months. I'm living with 7 Chinese guys in a dorm. I said, keep doing that. Immerse yourself in this culture, this great culture and society. Learn Mandarin fluently. But there's so few people like that right now. So I actually worry. You've asked a very serious question, and I've given you an inadequate answer. We want to be hospitable to Chinese students in this country, and we should be. And we don't want you to go home. But there's certain areas of study that I don't think you should be in, and President Trump and President Biden both agree on that. But we certainly want young Americans to understand China, and I worried, here was my advantage when I was ambassador. I had hundreds of Americans who were fluent in Mandarin. This was their 2nd, 3rd, or 4th time living. These are U.S. government employees living in China. They understood the culture, the language, and the people, and they wanted to be there. I felt really blessed, and I felt it was a huge benefit to me to have that. I worried about the American ambassador 10 to 15 years from now. If you have a pipeline of 1,105 students, we're not going to produce in this country young people who understand Mandarin and China, and for our government, for our corporations, for our universities, for our professoriate, we're just not going to have the number of people who understand your country.
So can I
and if we're going to live in peace, we have to have more Americans focused on China.
So now I want to take it back to energy, ask you a question. So as you mentioned, China supplies the rare earths that are used in many energy devices. China makes most of the world's solar panels. China owns a big chunk of the wind market, the windmills. China is dominating electric vehicles. So there's like big parts of the trade picture where China is not quite monopoly, but very dominant positions. And there's also things that we trade from America where we're very dominant in, design of computer chips and many things too, right? And when the countries are at peace with each other and have good relations, it's fine. We buy stuff from them, they buy stuff from us, everybody's happy, right? But if this situation is posed that we're in a big conflict, then this is kind of a dangerous situation to be in. But on the other hand, we both agree there's a big climate problem, and really that everybody should be installing solar panels and windmills and switching to electric cars and doing all kinds of innovations to reduce our climate harm all the time. So how do you square this in your mind where you have, in one respect, we should be cooperating and we should just be buying solar panels. Right now we have a big tariff on them, so they're not buying them so much.
Yeah.
But we should be. But on the other hand, they are dumping them. They're selling them to us for less than the cost of production. So in some ways we're entitled to tariff them, but is it really in the public interest? But then on the other hand, the rare earths, you can't build a tank unless you have some rare earths.
Right.
And so, I can see the military says this is really not a safe situation that we're importing all our rare earths from one country. So how's your view of this competition cooperation?
I think it's one of the most complicated issues in the relationship to break down. And there's so much to say. Just a couple of examples, Professor. On rare earths, I think the Trump administration did a good thing last week by putting together this consortium of countries, non-Chinese, who understand that it's not in our national interests, plural, to be solely dependent on one source for critical materials, critical minerals. Now, here's the problem. That's going to take a long time to develop alternative mining, but also processing. And the cost of that, and you would know more, both of you would know more about the technical barriers, it's going to be really high. But I think the Trump administration is right, as President Biden was, to try to diversify sources on rare earths. When it comes to advanced technology, it's also complicated. I'll give you an example. President Biden decided in October 2023 to prohibit the sale of American advanced semiconductors into the Chinese market, especially for AI purposes. Why did he do that? Because of the civil-military fusion in China itself. If you're a Chinese company and you're importing a key technology, a sensitive technology from anywhere in the world, the PLA has the right to come to you and say, we want that technology, we want your software engineers, you're working for us now. That doesn't happen in the United States. It's not obligatory. It can be voluntary. But we didn't want a situation, given that military competition, that was the first thing I talked about, where the PLA would have a leg up because they had these advanced semiconductors. And so I very much disagree with President Trump's decision to allow NVIDIA to sell the H200 chip into China. For that reason, but also, and some people here would know more about this, the AI competition. Why would we give China a lead on that when we're trying to protect the American edge, if there is one right now? It's hard to measure on AI. So the Chinese called me in 100 times to remonstrate with me on these prohibitions that we had, both on certain technologies being prohibited for American export and certain private equity investment into Chinese companies by American firms. And I always said the same thing. We're doing this because we're competing with you. It's in our national interest. And by the way, you're doing the same thing to us. You just don't talk about it. China has a whole series of regulations that prohibit Chinese private equity from investing in Boston, Cambridge, MIT, and other parts of our high-tech economy. And they also prohibit certain manufactured products from being exported. So we're both doing it. Where it gets really complicated is the example you gave. And that is, don't we want to produce a movement here towards green technology? I do, as a citizen, and President Biden did. His theory was, we don't want Chinese companies to dominate the market. We want to help grow an American domestic market, thus the tariffs, but also thus the $269 billion in incentives that has now been, I think, dismantled by the Trump administration. So I actually think President Biden had the right policy. I'm sorry that President Trump has taken some of the decisions he's had, but one more kicker here that I can't really answer with any certainty. President Trump, you've noticed he's unpredictable. And that's not a criticism. He's going to have a summit meeting with President Xi Jinping in Beijing in April. And it's been interesting to watch President Trump. I think he's been, and this is not a criticism, he's been more solicitous of President Xi Jinping, in his public comments, than with any other leader in the world. President Trump is signaling he wants a stable relationship. He's signaling he wants a successful summit. Who is leading in the preparation for the summit? In any prior summit, it would have been the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. It would have been hardcore national security. Scott Bessent is leading. This is going to be a summit that hopefully will continue the trade truce and the supply chain truce so we can have a stable year of 2026 economically, globally. That's good. But I worry that human rights is not in the agenda. I haven't seen the president talk about Chinese military support for the Russian defense industrial base, and what we said in the Biden administration is that we thought that Chinese firms were providing about 90% of the microelectronics for the Russian defense industrial base. President Trump seems to be focused only on the economic issue. I think that's too limited, but here is maybe the sliver of hope that President Trump, who knows, he might want to agree to some forms of economic and technological cooperation that President Biden was not willing to do in order to achieve this stability in the relationship. Could that include CATL providing batteries to American automobile manufacturers? Ford tried that, and in the Biden administration with the Congress, it was shot down. I don't know. I'm not predicting it. I don't know. I'm out of government, but the unpredictability factor, and married to wanting to have a stable relationship, they might find a way to be creative that could possibly, let's just put it that way, be of advantage to the green technology issues that you and I agree are important for our country.
Take one more question. Maybe on the side here.
Hi, my name is Carla, and I'm a grad student of law, but not here in the Netherlands in Europe.
Very good.
Focusing on tech law, actually. Both of you have said that the key to not ending this in a bad way is getting both economies on the same pace, and also learning how to communicate. Having served in China, what do you think are the biggest misperceptions the U.S. and China hold about one and each other, and how do you think that diplomatic channels can reduce those misperceptions?
Well, thank you very much for your question. And obviously, as a diplomat, I think we're going to be better off if our two societies engage. That's why I'm in favor of American students in China, Chinese students in this country, and if our governments do a better job. But let me tell you what the record is. Until 2023, when we hadn't had a Secretary of State or Treasury or Commerce visit China in 5 years. Until Gavin Newsom visited in 2023, I spent 5 days with him in China, we hadn't had a governor visit in 6 years. During 2022, my first full year, because of zero COVID, all the lockdowns, the masking, the testing, daily testing in China, we had very, very few CEOs come through or business people. I think, Professor, you visited in 2023. I said, you should have called me because I would have given you dinner.
Yeah.
It was rare to see. Another aspect of this, we had about 240,000 Americans living in China, full-time, pre-pandemic. We think we lost about half that population, just came home, mainly the business population, and a student. So one thing that's really worried me, if you think about how do we keep the peace in a very difficult competitive relationship through citizen engagement, through business, student engagement, tourism. We had 5.5 million tourists between the two countries in 2019. That went down to a couple 100,000. So you can see the two countries just kind of shut down. That's what I worried about. That's one of the things I worried about, most seriously. So I think a better way to try to keep a long-term peace is to have our two societies connected. And we've talked about all the ways that we can do that.
All right.
I'm Mary Lou Jepson, MIT alum. Just saw it, looked like an interesting talk. It's fascinating. In the sense of discussion of peace, what do you see that could happen in influencing Xi vis-a-vis Taiwan and his intent? Or what can you postulate?
Well, my assumption is that, if you think about President Xi's agenda, which he's talked about, the Chinese dream, overcoming the century of humiliation, the Opium Wars, the weakness of the Qing dynasty, the Japanese occupation, all of that. Macau's back. Hong Kong is back. Tibet and Xinjiang, I will use a word, pacified savagely. in the late 1940s, early 1950s. I mean, by force, brought
As was
back.
Taiwan, actually, but the facts aren't really relevant.
Well, I was just going to say, so if you think about it, Chinese population and Chinese leadership and President Xi want to bring Taiwan back under the control of the mainland. That has not happened since 1895.
Well, when China says Taiwan's always been part of China, that's actually true for a third of the island for 7 years,
So,
ending in 1895. But again,
Okay,
that's
okay, yeah.
actually. But the thing is, how to avoid the war? Like there are
yeah, I'm
the.
getting to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I just thought I'd give you the context.
Yeah.
How do the Chinese think about this?
Of course.
If you look at the netizens on Weibo and WeChat, if I talk to anybody, I don't think I met a Chinese citizen who didn't believe that Taiwan should come back. Now, to the control of the mainland. The problem is that the Chinese are determined. It may be that their plans have been delayed by these extraordinary purges of the PLA senior leadership by President Xi, not just in the last 12 years, he's done a lot of that, but the last several months. But I don't think that's going to be true forever. And we believe, and President Nixon every president has said, we have an obligation to help Taiwan defend itself. That's in the Taiwan Relations Act of January 1979. The Trump administration correctly, and I support them, has announced an arms sale of $11 billion. Why are we doing this? To build up deterrence, to make Taiwan a tougher nut to crack, to increase the probability of difficulty, the level of difficulty for the PLA as it thinks how to do this. And it's interesting that the smartest people that I know who are thinking through Taiwan war scenarios outside the government increasingly think that it is not an easy thing to conduct a combined forces operation across 100 miles of open water, that the PLA may decide too difficult, probability of success too low. So what's an alternative strategy, an anaconda strategy? A slow, imperceptible kind of tying a net, drawing of a net by military force, by customs duties, by intimidation around the island of Taiwan. But I have become increasingly of the view that we need to continue to stand up and demand, and I would tell the Chinese government this when I was in China, China needs to commit to a peaceful resolution of this dispute, and they won't, because they want Taiwan back at all costs. Closing the Taiwan Strait, which would happen in any kind of a warlike situation, would be a major event for the global economy. 50% of supercontainer traffic goes through the Taiwan Strait every month. So I think what we need is Japan, the United States, the Philippines, Australia, and a lot of global South countries counseling the Chinese. There's going to be major problems if you do this, certainly sanctions. And what the United States has always been ambiguous about is what we would do militarily. And that's been American policy since President Nixon. I think it's worked. I think we should maintain that ambiguity, keep the Chinese guessing, which raises the level of doubt, I think, in Chinese military circles. So long answer, but not long enough. It's a lot more complicated than that. But I think as Americans, we should want the people of Taiwan to decide their own destiny. 25 million people. They live in a democracy. They're succeeding. They have civil liberties. We should not want to see that island taken over by force. And I think there's an agreement between Republicans and Democrats on that in our country. So thank you for your question.
All right, so I think I need to cut this off because we're running so late. Though I don't know if Ambassador Burns is willing to stay around and chat with people afterwards. There's food downstairs, is that right? Yes. Okay, so if you have time, there's food downstairs. If you're hungry, there's food downstairs. Before you leave, I must announce that this is just one in a seminar series, and our next seminar will be on March 17th in this room, same time, and we'll be hosting Georgina Campbell-Flatter, who's the CEO of Greentown Labs, a major tech incubator here both in Massachusetts and also in Houston. And I look forward to seeing you then, and I look forward to seeing you downstairs. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot.